Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Emergent Resilience, Paths to Healing and Creative Power. I'm Rachel Hardy, and this episode is part 2 of my story. If you have not listened to part 1 yet, you'll want to hear that first for it all to make sense. Also, I'm going to put a gentle trigger warning on this one for anyone who has dealt with things like anxiety or PTSD or depression. Because I'm going to talk about some things I went through, and some parts of it were quite intense, so I want you to be aware of that, and to take care of yourself and pause if you need. But I'm also going to tell you how I got through. So, I began to titrate off of the medication. I'd been on Aksthesia for 14 years. I would titrate off very, very slowly over several months. I had a lot of support in place. At this point in my life, I had already spent the past 20 years intensely devoted to my health as my top priority, and to seeking out all of the processes and practices and support that I could possibly find. The mind-body health game was strong, and I thought I was well prepared for what I was going to go through. And I was not. I began to experience various different symptoms as I slowly went off the meds. And the things my body began experiencing are tough to describe. For quite a while, it was really difficult even to get my head around what was happening. It was really through reading forums and groups full of so many people who had gone off similar meds, who were going through similar things, that it started to piece together into any kind of sense at all. So first, there was a deep agitation. This is a phenomenon that's called Aksthesia. It's like a very strong restless energy, although the word restless does not describe the intensity of it. It was like at a level that made me want to jump out of my body in the most extreme way. And it came and went in waves, building and building, often peaking in a burst of sobbing and tears, and that crying would seem to relieve some of the intensity for a bit, and then it would start again. There was also a sort of electric shock. It was a sensation like an electric shock that would shoot through my brain and body. And it would happen randomly, but it was also triggered constantly by moving my eyes, or this part's hard to explain, but it was triggered by moving my thoughts. It wasn't that I was thinking stressful things. Somehow the action of thinking, should I make a smoothie? Do I have bananas? Where are my shoes? That act of thinking the most ordinary thoughts would trigger this electric shock-like sensation. And so I functioned as best as I could, trying not to move my eyes too much, trying as best as I could not to think, just sort of putting one foot in front of the other, head down, eyes down, and do the next thing I had to do. Figured I'd brave through it, be rough for a patch, and I'd be done. Except that it kept getting worse. There was a sort of dread that would pour through me. This was also triggered by the action of moving my eyes. And it was bizarre because the feeling of dread was not attached to anything. It wasn't linked to any meaning or fear or any kind of trigger in a meaning way. It was just triggered by that action of moving my eyes, and over again, this full body experience of the most terrible dread pouring through me. I also began experiencing panic attacks, which had never happened in my life before. I had dealt so much with depression, but the panic attacks were totally new, and it was right at the edge of unbearable. Sometimes there was like a rush of energy lifting up so strong that I felt like I was going to lift out through my head, and it was all I could do to stay in my body. I remember it happened several times as I was driving, and I would be slapping on my body as hard as I could and shouting, "Stay here, stay here, stay here," to myself. And I would have to pull over on the side of the road and slap on my body and the steering wheel and stomp on the floor to try to keep myself from lifting out of my head, which was what it felt like was happening. But the worst of all were the nights, because every single night I would fall asleep and then I would awaken into my heart pounding out of my chest and what I can only describe as a level of extreme sheer terror, beyond, not just beyond anything I'd ever experienced, but it was literally a terror beyond anything I could have imagined. It was like a feeling that belonged to another reality, another dimension. And the craziest part was I knew what was happening. I knew that my brain and body were just going through this process, but that knowing did not in any way lessen the feeling of the terror. And there would be nothing to do but lie there and try to breathe as best as I could and wait for the terror to pass, and it would often last for hours. This happened every single night. At the same time as all of this, it seemed as if all my old latent health issues reared up, which made sense due to the extreme stress that my body was under, making it hard to function, hard to think, as if I was constantly in a fog. I sat in a doctor's office, having just been through rounds of tests, with nothing showing off except for some mildly low vitamin D levels. There were no explanations on the tests for the insanity I was experiencing in my body and mind, and I was trying my best to explain what I was going through. And the doctor just sat there and stared at me blankly. And this is where, if we're going to move forward, we got to acknowledge some of the dysfunction in the system that is going on. Because if you talk to people, my story of going off these kinds of meds is hardly unique. And yet, one of the interesting things about our medical system is that doctors receive most of their training about medications from the pharmaceutical reps themselves. And when there is a strongly vested interest and a lot of money on the line in something working well, if you follow the money, that's going to affect the versions of what gets taught and what gets told. And we have a situation going on where so many people who go off of these and similar medications are suffering similar experiences to mine. And yet the official version remains that discontinuation symptoms of Effexor, if present at all, are mild and last for a couple of weeks. Now, I think it feels important to say that I do not see pharmaceutical companies as inherently evil, as I sometimes hear said. I think that black and white thinking and labeling groups, organizations, people, movements as all one thing completely misses the depth and complexity of our world, and the truth lies in the complexity of all that we are, not in a simplistic label that fits on a meme. There has been so much suffering relieved through modern medicine, and I have definitely experienced that firsthand. And when someone is in immense pain, relieving that pain is an enormously good thing. But because of the complexity of where we are and the challenges that our world and our health face, we're also required to recognize when things are out of balance. And the thing is that along with the relief and the sometimes life-saving support that comes from psychotropic medication, there's also another side. And because of the way in which the information about these medications is transferred with a clear bias and deeply vested interest, there is an imbalance going on as a result. And there is harm being done that is not being acknowledged. And so the doctor sat there staring at me blankly as I described what was going on. And he finally pronounced that it sounded like I needed to go back on my meds. And the weeks turned into months, and it did not get any better. I sought out a psychiatrist in Pasadena who had been specializing for many years in working with people going off these medications. He confirmed that my experience was far from unusual, and there was sort of some relief in that, but the prognosis was not hopeful. He was finding that for folks who had been on the meds for at least around 10 years, this kind of reaction was not uncommon. In fact, if someone had been on the meds for more than 10 years, he told me, he was recommending that they don't try to go off of them because of the likely possibility of this outcome. What was really troubling was that he was finding when this response happened, even if the person went back on the medication, that action of going back on did not necessarily help and would often cause even further dysregulation. So while it was kind of good to have some validation, there was not a whole lot of hope. This doctor was finding sometimes beta blockers or minute doses of Xanax helped. He tried both of those with me, but it just scrambled things further and made it worse. It was as if some level of dysregulation was reached that my body was unable to bring itself back from. Now, the interesting thing is that we know this does not happen with everyone, and some people do successfully go off long-term medication, including SSRIs, SNRIs, and benzos, without extreme or significantly troubling effects. Looking at it from what I know now, from my nervous system and somatic experiencing training, my hunch is that a history of trauma in the system is going to be a significant, or perhaps even the defining factor here. Because a nervous system that has not developed an adequate base of self-regulation will struggle to manage stimuli and be overloaded and flooded much more easily. And perhaps the level of stress on the body, when the chemicals that the brain has been relying on for years are withdrawn, for a nervous system with a history of trauma, it may be simply too much, and the body can't find its way back to any kind of coping mechanism or any kind of base level of okayness, like it's lost at sea without any way to get back. That's what it felt like for me. Avexor withdrawal is often compared to going off heroin from those who have experienced both. And I cannot speak to heroin withdrawal, but things got to a point where it was agony to be in my body, literally all the time. I survived moment to moment, breath by breath. I had built a strong muscle through my life of just do the next thing, do what I need to do, and get through the next moment, and then the next. During all of this, I was continuing to run a bodywork practice, as that was how I made my living. And I leaned on the muscle I'd built of being able to show up, being able to drop into the moment and be present, moment to moment to moment, and focus on doing what I knew how to do. And some interesting things happened during this time. Most of my professional training and experience in bodywork and energy work had happened in the context of being on the meds, and I was extremely hypersensitive on them. I'd learned through all of my training how to work with my highly sensitive energy. Since childhood, I had experienced a phenomenon known as mirror neuron synesthesia, where seeing another person's experience would cause actual physical sensations in me. And like many or most synesthetes, I had no idea or never thought about the fact that this was not normal until I began my energy work training and began to unpack in depth the experience of working with other people's energy systems. So anyway, the extreme sensitivity had always been a part of my life, but once I went off of the medication, it was like my sensitivity levels blasted through the roof. And I started in sessions being flooded with so much information, imagery, sensation. Much of it I did not even know what to do with because it was blasting in at such strong levels, it was hard to sort out what was happening much of the time. During this time, one of the forms of synesthesia I'd always experienced took on some new qualities, and the lines got further blurred between sight and touch. They kind of melded into one sensory experience. And so in sessions, I would be flooded constantly with all of this information. And although it was really challenging to piece out what was happening, my overall sense was that it was quite beneficial to the clients that I worked on. And one of the bizarre things to witness was that all the while I felt like I was dying, my clients were continuing to experience better and better results, and my practice kept going. And there was something fascinating about that. I don't know if I could say that it gave me hope, but it almost did, and I clung to the almost. But meanwhile, I was losing my ability to feel any hope at all. And the most surreal part of things was watching the hope and the goodness in life gradually disappear. One of the practices I would do would be to write down the good moments. Even if there was only one in a day or even one moment I could find in a week, I would bring my attention to it. It might be a single moment where I felt the wind on my face as I was walking, or had a sudden surge of just a sense of the goodness of life, and I would know that at some point in the future I would be okay again. And just for a minute, I would know it. And I carried around this little orange notebook that was devoted to writing down these moments, a second of relief, a glimmer of hope, capturing them whenever they arose. But then what was so surreal was that I watched as these moments faded and faded out altogether. And even though I still looked, the ability to feel any kind of anything good faded out entirely and was gone. And then it was only a world of the electric shocks and the pain and the exhaustion beyond words, and just putting one foot in front of the other. It got to a point where I had no hope that I would come out on the other side, because I had lost all ability to imagine or remember anything other than this bizarre existence. And my plan was to continue to take another step and another step for as long as I could, and when I could not go on anymore, then I would end it. And I existed in this bizarre and surreal state for over a year. Things continued to get weirder and weirder. Neurologically, it was like a chaotic free-for-all happening in my brain. There would be these loud pops, like gunshots, but deep inside my head, random, loud enough to make me jump. Sometimes it was more like words spoken from somewhere in my brain. I woke up one night, jolted awake to the sound of someone shouting my name over and over loudly, except it was coming from deep inside my head. I was living in a madhouse, a strange universe with no way out. And perhaps the toughest part of all was being unable to talk about it. There's an area of the brain called Broca's area. It's one of the speech centers of the brain. Bessel van der Kolk, in his best-selling work, The Body Keeps the Score, describes some of his research where the brains of trauma survivors were observed through MRIs while they were describing or remembering traumatic events. And one of the things that was observed was that whenever a flashback was triggered, Broca's area went offline. In fact, it went so offline that van der Kolk compares it to what you would observe during a stroke, where there's a total loss of brain function to that region, to that speech and language center. And one of the overarching qualities of this year that was so painful was the persistent inability to translate sensations, experiences, and what I was going through into any kind of words that I could explain, or even being able to conceptually get my own head around what was going on. I often felt like a blind and deaf person being beaten with no clue what was happening or no way of knowing where the next blow was coming from. And my experience of this wordless terror is consistent with what van der Kolk and others are finding when they look at what happens in the brain during extreme trauma. And this shutting down of the language center is one of those things that can happen. About 8 months into the saga, I had to acknowledge to myself that things were not getting better. In fact, it was actually getting worse. The concept of feeling okay, of feeling even a moment of okayness, continued to feel like a farther and farther distant memory, like from another lifetime. I kept going to all of my healers, sometimes lying on the table in the care of my energy worker, Heather, who'd been my teacher and healer and mentor for so many years. While she would work on me for that hour, it was like I could almost imagine feeling okay. She would say to me, there's like a switch stuck on. It's kind of between second, third chakra. It's like a switch and it's stuck. I had other healers echo similar words. And my adrenals were, in fact, stuck on, as happens when the body gets stuck in a fixated stress response. And they were unable to shut off with stress hormones in massive amounts pouring through my body. Sometimes I would call up my dad many states away, and I would just sit on the phone and cry. And I usually didn't have words, and I couldn't explain what was happening. And I could hear his deep concern, and he would ask me what he could do. And mostly, I couldn't even talk. But if I couldn't get the words out, he would sit there on the phone with me, and just sit there with me while I cried. I would do all that I could to hold on. Somewhere there had to be goodness. I thought if I could remember what goodness, what okayness, what happiness felt like, maybe I could bring it back into my experience somehow. And with whatever bits of energy I had, I would try to imagine my way back to happiness. And not just imagine it, but I would try to draw it. I would dance it. I would sing it. I would use all my ability to try to create it in any way. And I would try every day to remember what happiness felt like. But it was only a vague, shadowy memory that had existed in another world, and I couldn't quite remember what it was. I was pretty sure it had existed, somewhere in the past, and I could remember something like an outline of it, like the shape of happiness, but I could not remember it. I dreamed one night that I was climbing through what seemed like universes or dimensions or realities, lifetimes perhaps. I was climbing and searching, and everywhere I was seeking for answers. The answers, the healing had to be somewhere. It had to exist, and if I searched long enough and hard enough, I would find it. But I climbed and I searched, and I could not find the answers in any universe, any reality, anywhere. And I woke up, and in a strange reversal, I woke up in despair into the nightmare I was living that I could not escape from. And then there was the moment I remember very clearly. I was driving on the 118 freeway north of LA, and the sun was setting, and I looked at the sunset, and I could see it, but I couldn't feel the goodness of looking at it. And I realized how long it had been since I'd felt any kind of goodness. Only the profound, utter exhaustion of a year plus without rest, spending all day navigating the shocks and the dread, only to go to sleep at night into the terror. Had a couple things left to try. I had a healing session coming up that I was going to do, and the thought dropped in that I needed to try CBD oil. My friend Andrea had suggested that way back when things were just starting to get really bad, and I had mentioned to her that I had been nauseous and unable to eat for the past 4 weeks. And she said, "You need to try CBD." But my body was so crazy sensitive, and the thought of putting anything stronger than water in my overtaxed system terrified me. But I might be at a point where there was nothing to lose. And I looked at the sunset, and I began to cry even before the thought was fully formed, because I sensed what was coming. And I said, "I'll do the 5 elements healing session, and I'll try CBD. And if those don't work, if those don't help, I'm ready to be done. And I'm ready to leave this life knowing I gave it all I had." It wasn't desperation, it was more like a calm readiness, and knowing that I would have reached that point of having given it my all. And a strange sort of deep relief settled over me, because there might be an end in sight, and I would have made it through. I did the 5 elements healing session, and it was profound and felt transformational. And like so much of the healing work I had been doing, I could sense something had changed, but my body still did not feel any better. I would have this endless dialogue with myself, this "if a tree falls in a forest" kind of question. But my question was, if healing is happening but I can't physically feel it, is it really happening? Because our physical bodies are these vehicles for everything we experience, and the physical manifestation of our emotions, our thoughts, our whole experience. And is it possible to heal if you're doing endless work, but the body can't feel the healing, which was where I seemed to be stuck, with my body in this extreme version of overload and dysregulation. For the next couple days, the only thing that mattered was where and how do I get CBD. It was legal in California, that wasn't the issue, but it was more the whole idea of having to figure out where to go and what questions to ask at a time when something like tying my shoes often left me in tears of frustration, and going to the grocery store could be an all-day ordeal. The idea of trying to navigate finding CBD felt like an impossible journey of its own. And then 3 days later, my friend Patrick called me up. He's a very brilliant composer and pianist, and he had injured his hand. He wasn't able to play, and physiotherapy was bringing only partial relief. And he said, "Is this something that you think you could help with?" And I had no idea whether I could help, but I so wanted to try. And as often would happen, some sort of energy would kick in when someone needed help, especially someone who I deeply cared about. And he said, "Well, can you come over? We can hang out and I'll make us dinner and you can just see if you can work on my hand and maybe it'll help." And so I braved the traffic and made it to the west side, and straight away I began to work on his hand, and I felt like what felt like a knot deep in the palm, and I worked on it and released it, and he stretched his hand and he said, "It's better, but it's still restricted." And I worked on it some more, and when he stretched his hand again, the knot was gone. And I said, "Play that phrase, the one where it kept catching." And he played the piano, and the restriction was totally gone. His hand was free, and I could see and feel his deep relief. And there was something amazing to be able to help in the midst of everything, and yet the reality was still there. And Patrick asked me, "And how are you?" And I said, "I'm not good." And I began to tell him what was going on. When I finished talking, Patrick was silent for a moment, and then he walked out of the room, and when he came back, he said, "There's something I really, really want you to try." and he handed me a vial of CBD oil. And I just stared at it for a minute because I hadn't told Patrick that part of the story. I hadn't told him about my declaration to myself and the universe that I'd try CBD, and if it didn't work, then I was done. And here it was, quite literally, being handed to me. And so for a moment, I just stared. And then I took it home with me, and I sat on it for a week because I was afraid to put anything in my body. Things were already so at the level of unbearable. And then there was the day I put the tiniest dab of the gel on my finger and put it on my tongue, and I went out for my walk as I did every day as long as I could stand. And as I walked through the hills looking at the spring bloom around me, I noticed something fascinating. Colors looked brighter. I had not realized that my world had quite literally grayed, but there was a brightness and a color that was back. And echoing many, many years earlier, that told me something was happening. And so I kept going, and I took the CBD twice a day, and within a week, I was sleeping soundly through the whole night, every single night. And my body breathed the deepest sigh of relief it had ever known, because if I could come out of the terror enough to sleep, then perhaps my body had a fighting chance to be able to heal. Within a few weeks, there was a subtle but noticeable lessening of some of the shock-like and dread sensations. Within 2 months, I had my first experience of remembering what happiness felt like. It was still there. And the next 2 years would be a pretty epic journey of bringing myself all the way to full health. And I want to tell you what happened and what I did over the next 2 years to completely change what was going on in my body, to move all the way out of the withdrawal symptoms, also to completely turn around both the depression and all of the chronic health symptoms that had plagued me for so many years. So, the CBD was the first piece, of course. The CBD brought in some base level of regulation, allowing my body to come down out of that extreme stress response that it had been stuck in. And the ability to come out of that was crucial for me to be able to start to heal. Now, during the darkest hours of 2016, I had been introduced to a healing modality called Somatic Experiencing. This is a type of work developed by Dr. Peter Levine, and it works by healing and regulating the nervous system. During the darkest hours of 2016, I'd been introduced to a healing modality called Somatic Experiencing. This is a type of work developed by Dr. Peter Levine that works by healing and regulating the nervous system and releasing trauma and releasing that fixated stress response on a body level. And I had begun doing this work, and I had sensed immediately that there was something here. Even when I couldn't quite feel any help or hope, I had some kind of sense that it was right, that it was helping. And what happened was that as soon as the CBD brought in that base bit of regulation, then it was like all of the work started to take, and I could feel the effects of what was happening in my system in a much more profound way. And as I worked with healing my nervous system, with slowly bringing more regulation on board, helping the body to come out of that stuck response, helping my kidneys and adrenals to relax, and my body to come down out of fight, flight, and safely land. And I began to watch and sense the effects of healing my nervous system. And I also became aware of how much This dysregulation at the nervous system level had played into the symptoms and conditions that I had experienced for my whole life. And I found that this work, after doing decades of so much healing work, I found that it was creating shifts in my body and mind in a completely different way than anything before. And because this work was changing things for me so profoundly, even when it felt impossible, some part of me knew that if there was a future that existed that held the soonest possible minute I was able to do so, I knew I was going to be training in this work to bring it to other folks to heal as well. And that is exactly what would happen. And as soon as I was able to do so, I would begin the journey of my own 3-year training as a somatic experiencing practitioner, heading down to Dana Point in Southern California to meet and study and train with an incredible group of teachers and mentors and colleagues, many of whom would become very dear friends. And I credit this work of healing and regulating my nervous system as a key and primary piece, not only in reversing the withdrawal symptoms, but also playing a major role in transforming my entire body and health. And there was more to the story as well. I had begun reading the work of a man named Anthony Williams, also known as the medical medium, a spiritual channel, and he was writing about chronic health conditions. And I was interested because he had a lot to say about the Epstein-Barr virus, the virus that had started it all back when I was 14. And he was talking about the effects of EBV on our bodies, as well as about other viral and bacterial and toxic loads. And everything he was saying made so much sense to me and fit so well with everything I had experienced for my whole life. And I decided to follow his nutritional and dietary protocols, even though I was already eating what I believed to be a squeaky clean diet for many years. And what he was teaching about diet and nutrition actually differed in some significant ways than a lot of the information that was and is currently out there. But I was intrigued enough to see what happened if I followed his process. And what happened was that after going through many months of intensive detoxing symptoms, the level of detox was high for several months, and then I came out into an experience of feeling good, including energy levels, clarity in my mind, in a way that I had not felt in almost 30 years. I had forgotten what it felt like to be in a body that just feels good. And the journey from there would not be linear. Things would continue to go up and down for a bit, and I would go through more cycles of detoxing and up-leveling, as healing tends to do. But the overall trajectory of my levels of energy and clarity and feeling good only continued to get better and better and better. And I do want to mention that this kind of experience of chronic health issues completely turning around is actually pretty common in the experience of those who follow Anthony Williams' work. And if you have any kind of physical issue that is not responding to treatment, I would very highly recommend that you check out what he has to say and be willing to consider letting go of some of what you think you know, because having your health and your body functioning effortlessly and feeling good is the most amazing thing, and it's worth going through a little bit of stuff to get there. And I'm recording this today from a body that is completely free from both the symptoms that I went through for 16 months after going off the meds, and also completely free from the depression, from the fatigue, the brain fog, and all of the symptoms that I experienced for so many years are 100% gone. And there are so many pieces to a healing process, so many factors, but those things were the bottom line needle movers for me. The CBD, healing my nervous system, and Anthony Williams' nutritional and dietary approach to deal with the pathogens and toxic loads in my body. And of course, there were so many more pieces. There were many more practitioners and healers who supported me, both supported me through and also played crucial and significant roles in my support and healing. More than I have time to go into now. Perhaps they will be subjects of future episodes. But once I had some baseline functioning on board, there was still more work to be done. In a good way. One of the first things I did as soon as I could was seek out one of my favorite humans named Bonnie Gillespie, a coach for creatives who I had met some 20 years-ish earlier. And I jumped into her programs because I knew or sensed that having that creative energy flowing through and being a part of my life was crucial to my healing. And I began to connect with my community and to shoot scenes and create film projects together. And I got into a wonderful acting class. And I found that, yes, once again, as many years before, when I turned to creative work for solace and healing, once again, this work was very, very good for me and somehow was a flow that filled the well and was a necessary and crucial part of my life. One of the things that I got the very strong, inspired direction that I had to do, even though it scared me, was to create what was kind of like a one-woman show. But it wasn't for the public, it was for me to share my story. And I called in a small group of women, some of the friends and healers who had been present for me during this dark night of the soul. And using theater, the language of my soul, I created a piece where I told my story. The whole healing journey, including parts of it which I had never said out loud before. And I will be forever grateful to Helen and Asia and Rachel and Ryan and Heather and Jen for holding space for me that night. And along with the creative work, there was also a lot of mindset type work to be done. Some retraining my thoughts, because my thoughts had been very stuck in some very dark places for a long time. So there was some really, really important retraining and redoing of my mindset. And this was key and was a crucial final piece. But I do want to emphasize that this was a later piece. And I think that's important to say because sometimes it can be necessary to do some more base level healing work first. And what I mean by that, there's a good deal of emphasis in the healing worlds on mindset and thinking positive and change your thoughts, change your life. And from my observation, even much of what we call body-mind healing generally comes from an intellectual place. It starts with the mind. And all of that type of work is powerful, good, true, effective, and has its place. And also, it may not necessarily be appropriate advice for someone who's in the midst of a severe mental health crisis. Because trying to heal depression or anxiety from your own thoughts can be kind of like trying to operate on your own broken arm with your broken arm hand holding the scalpel. Because when the brain and body have lost a certain capacity to function, the thoughts may not actually have the ability to go there and stay there. And I believe this is the deep gift of folks like Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine and others who have brought to this world this idea of bottom-up processing. The ability to do the body-mind healing from the body level up rather than starting from the mind down. And it can be another way in when mental or intellectual mind-based approaches are not the full solution. This type of work is one of the things that gives me a lot of hope for re-envisioning how we work with mental wellness and resilience going forward. And so I sat in my advanced year of Somatic Experiencing training in a conference center in Golden, Colorado. Final year training with an organization and modality and a group of incredible people who I had come to deeply love and respect. And yet I was listening to the instructor Joshua talk, and I was shaking and I was scared. And I was scared because I knew this final year of SE training included a strong focus on syndromal conditions in the body. For example, conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome or myalgic encephalitis, the official label given to what I had dealt with for 30 years. And we would be looking at the relationship between underlying nervous system dysregulation and this and many other syndromal type conditions. And I understood this correlation now and how deep it was. And I knew that this nervous system healing piece had been an absolutely critical part of my healing process. And I also knew it wasn't the full story. There was another piece that had been crucial in my particular experience, and it involved Anthony Williams' work, changing my diet and healing and treating the toxic loads and pathogens that had been wreaking havoc in my body for so many years. And I was afraid because I was scared that Joshua was going to talk about syndromal patterns in a way that oversimplified them to being just about nervous system dysregulation. And I was so tired of once again sitting in a body that didn't relate to the outside world or to any paradigms that I could explain or logically inhabit. And after a lifetime of being misheard, I was afraid of having my experiences explained away in a manner that wasn't quite accurate, didn't get the depth and the complexity and the full picture and truth. And so I sat there, paused and waiting. And I listened as Joshua said, "There is so much we don't know." And he went on to talk about how, in spite of how much understanding has been gained in the arena of how our nervous systems interplay with complex conditions of our health, the bottom line is that there is so much about our bodies that is unknown, and all of our understanding has to be held within that context. And the tears poured down my cheeks in relief. We don't know. The physicist David Bohm would have agreed with Joshua. In his book, Causality and Chance in Modern Physics, David Bohm argues that since nature was appearing to be infinite, that it would not be possible for any theory to completely explain something that is infinite. And he suggested that open scientific inquiry might be better served if researchers refrained from making the assumption that their theories were complete. And how surprising and unexpected in that moment that after a life of feeling hopeless around not having answers, that such a great relief would come from hearing someone say and acknowledge, "We don't know." Of course, one piece of that relief was about the pain of having someone misunderstand or mislabel your experience. But another part of it was about being comfortable with the unknown. I've always had a strong desire to know. I inherited something of the scientist in my dad. My dad had a doctorate degree in chemistry and a career in biotech, and when I was 11, he and my mom moved the family across the country so that my dad could take a new position at a young company, which at the time had no sales, no profits, but my dad sensed enough and saw enough in this company to take a position as a financial director of research and development and to move the family to Thousand Oaks, California. The company was called Amgen. They would go on to be one of the largest and most successful biotech companies in the world. I grew up hearing around the dinner table about Epogen and Neupogen, Amgen's first products, and what was happening with the clinical trials and how they were helping patients on kidney dialysis to be able to produce white blood cells again, radically changing the quality of their lives. And I had this model of the brightest promise of the future of science and technology, and some of the ways and the hope of how it was changing the world. And part of my struggle growing up and living for so long with unknown and painful things in my body was that I could not explain or interpret it through the lens of my dad's world, through the language of the scientist. It had no real explanation in that world and in that paradigm. But that's also exactly why it was the most healing thing to have my dad sit with me on the phone when I cried and when I didn't have the words. And when we don't know the answers or don't have the words, there is still hope and there is still healing. And sometimes that's even the space where the true healing lies. And sometimes a whole new kind of knowing can emerge from the body, from the soul, and from the deepest parts of what we know. And so I sat in that training in Colorado with tears pouring down my cheeks, and two dear friends came over and sat with me. And they just sat there just being with me, and that was all I needed, was to have them there. And I realized in relief that they got it without knowing any details, and I didn't even need to explain. And so that's the story of how I came through and healed completely from what had been a lifetime of struggle in my body, and came into living in a body with no strange symptoms and no brain fog and all the energy I need, and 100% free of the depression that plagued me for so long. And just to be super clear, though if you've listened to this far, I think you're probably my people and I don't need to explain this to you. But when I say depression is 100% gone, that doesn't mean trying to pretend life has no sadness or pretend away the full spectrum of emotions and experiences in life. It's about experiencing it all the emotions moving easily through in the way they're meant to do, but not getting stuck in any one experience, able to fully move through and experience the sadness and the joy. And then there was a moment when I remembered, after a lifetime of feeling mostly like I belonged on a different planet, and I felt that really, really strongly for a long time, like I seriously came to the wrong place. But there was a moment when I remembered, oh yes, this is what I came for. I did come to be here, and to be here now, in this moment, when the whole world is changing, and the new ways have to be reborn. I want to read a passage to you from Tom Cowan's Fire in the Head, Shamanism and the Celtic Spirit. Cowan writes, "The dispiritedness of the Fisher King gradually swept across the medieval world, as Christianity dissociated spirit from nature, thus causing the greatest case of soul loss in human history. The shamanic archetype was suppressed by the triumph of Western civilization, and we forgot or lost hope in one of the most persistent and life-affirming beliefs, the belief in shamanism. We forgot that it is a human talent to be able to pass between the worlds. We grew to mistrust all techniques of ecstasy and the knowledge acquired in trance states. So disparaged did shamanism become in the Western mind that when it was discovered again in the pre-industrial cultures of Native Americans, Siberians, Africans, Polynesians, and others, it was not recognized as something akin to what our ancestors in Europe could possibly once have practiced themselves. The modern European superiority complex made it almost impossible to recognize European shamanic practices that survived into historical times. So assured were we that our ancestors were always superior to primitive religious activities and beliefs. And so certain were we as Christians that all native pre-Christian spirituality was devil worship. Gradually, today, our arrogance is being tempered, and we are beginning to find meaning and value in so-called primitive spiritual practices. In a sense, we are currently retrieving the soul of shamanism, and are even now grafting it back onto the Western psyche. Perhaps the journeys into our shamanic heritage will lead us to a new wholeness, with ourselves, with each other, and with the earth. That's from Fire in the Head, Shamanism and the Celtic Spirit. And so, that's the story and that's my journey. The doctors told me it would be 6 to 9 months. It wound up being 30 years. I say that not to make the doctors wrong, who are doing their best, as we are all constantly doing the best with the knowledge that we have as we grow and learn more. But I share the time frame in part to recognize that it's possible, even after a long time, for things to completely turn around in the best ways. And even if it's hard to imagine, I want you to know how completely and totally things can change, and how completely our bodies have the capacity to heal. And for all of us to know that there is hope, that there are answers both discovered and not yet discovered, and more answers still waiting to be found. And that if we can enter in from a place of comfort with the unknown, and a recognition of how much is yet to be learned, and if we can listen to the wisdom that's been present for generations in Indigenous peoples, in the shamanic ways of knowing, in the vast knowledge of the world's collective cultures and traditions. And if we can approach science from a place of remembering the vastness of the universe and the vastness of what is still yet to be discovered. And if we can listen to the seeming paradoxes that we face in ourselves and each other, and allow ourselves to evolve in the very process of hearing and of listening, then we may have a much greater shot at knowing, at hearing what's next to emerge, at entering into the new paradigms of healing and health and wellness, of living in harmony with our bodies, with each other, and with the planet in the ways that are called for and crucial at this moment in our history. And so, welcome to the podcast. And I hope you'll journey with me, and together we'll learn. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being with me on this path in some form. And whether I know you in person or not, you're listening to this, and we're in this space together, and we're on this path together, and we are the ones we've been waiting for. And I'm sending you all my love. Be well.